So why don't we give you guys a little introduction to each of us?
Yeah, let's do that.
So that we
Let's
can
do
take
that.
you through who we are and what we do, and then
thank you.
I assume you want to let this be audience questions.
Yes, we'll do audience questions, and I think some questions are going to pop up on the screen
Great.
too.
So send them in over Slido, or feel free to just yell them out. Well, not yell them out, raise a hand. So we'll just do a minute apiece. I'm Ben Narrison. I'm a general partner at Canvas Ventures, the go-forward group out of Morgenthaler, a fund that was started in 1968. Canvas was started about 3 years ago, about $500 million under management, primarily Series A and B venture investing, and I've been looking at the AR and VR space for about 9 months, trying to decide if it's the right time for us to jump in. Prior to joining Canvas, I ran a seed practice for about 10 years, funding everybody from Lending Club to Zenefits, and before that I was an entrepreneur for 25 years.
Okay, thank you. My name is Koen Sanderink. I'm from the Netherlands. We're a public fund located in the south of the Netherlands. And we did a few VR investments in VRI and in Manus VR. And I'm here looking for other investors to co-invest. And I'm more than happy to answer your questions on the panel.
Hello, everybody. I'm Gene Munster. I'm a founding partner at Loop Ventures, and we're a seed stage venture capitalist that typically invests as part of a syndicate for people who are raising between $1 and $2 million. And AR and VR are two of our 4 themes. And previous to being at Loop, I was a sell-side stock analyst.
My name is Dylan Gale. I'm from Comcast Ventures. We are a multi-stage venture capital fund backed by Comcast Corporation. Myself and another colleague cover all things AR/VR and have been doing so for about the past 2 years. To date, we've made 7 investments in the AR/VR space.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Radhika. I think I'm the only unique one here in the group, the female representative. Thank you. Thank you for supporting. I'm from Silicon Catalyst. I'm a partner at Silicon Catalyst. We actually are an accelerator that supports and encourages semiconductor startups, exclusively silicon-based. So our market and our interests are in AR, VR, and AI currently. Thank you.
Hi, Sachin Deshpande, Qualcomm Ventures. We invest in the mobile ecosystem and then now the unbundling of the mobile ecosystem, which includes AR and VR. We have made, and I also look closely at a few investments in AR, VR, including Lightro on the light field capture side, Magic Leap, Matterport, and others.
Hi, so does anybody have any questions to ask right now? Oh, they're up here, okay. So what is the reality of AR and VR in venture capital? Who would like to answer that question?
I guess I have the microphone. I'll start if others do it. I think the reality is it's, while AR and VR are medium-term and long-term promising, I think the reality on Sand Hill Road is it's extremely difficult to get funding for early-stage capital. I think most of the money is coming from strategic funds like ourselves, although we do look at it, investment from a very financial-oriented lens, and also from Asia as well. I don't know the full reason for this. I will only surmise. I feel that a lot of the venture capitalists want to invest, but they're concerned, and they're concerned about a couple of things. In both VR and AR, there's platform risk, in addition to startup risk. So the way I feel they probably subconsciously think about it is there's platform risk, right, on the various AR platforms. There's not a leading AR platform, like iOS or Android, that you can build upon. And then on top of it, there's startup risk. So that's risk times risk. And so that's risk squared, and I think that's making people scared. But I don't think you guys should be overly concerned about that, because I do think there are pockets of opportunities, and we've invested in companies. In fact, one company I forgot to mention that we've invested in is Alchemy, which is a company based in Austin, Texas, that just sold to Google. And they just really found a real smart way to make revenue and get early-stage money from the people that are investing in it. So I don't know if that answers the question. I don't know if I answered that question, but any other thoughts on that?
I can let you use this.
Great. One on each end, perhaps.
Yeah.
So, there was an interesting data set put out not too long ago. I was looking at on the AR and VR investment that's happened over the last couple of years. And I don't think I saw a single traditional Silicon Valley venture firm on there. A lot of strategics, When I went recently to look at the AR landscape at CES in January, everybody I found interesting had money out of China. The way I look at it myself over these last 9 months is that we're at a sort of betwixt and between time, that there was the timing when there was an investment in the underlying hardware, right? And then there was probably the OS layer, there were lens makers and things like that. Personally, from my own view of what to look for, I'm looking for those endpoint solutions that could create truly enormous markets. And I think we're slightly in between. The sort of base hardware has been created, maybe there's better versions coming out, some of the operating system layers are being created, the tools. A lot of the things that we saw here in this room, have reflections of sort of the early days of the web. Sometimes overly simplistic attacks on the opportunity, sometimes very body shop-like structures where you can only scale by doing work one at a time for people. And traditionally what venture is looking for are huge markets that don't exist yet that can scale frictionlessly. How can I get to a multi-billion-dollar public company 10 years from now? And I'm not entirely convinced that that's where we are now. I think that's probably where we were, and now there's a slow period before we get there again.
Does anybody else can add to that?
Yeah, I agree with that. The reality is actually that we also don't know where it's heading. What we did in the Netherlands, actually in Western Europe, I did a market survey to get a little bit of grasp on the market. And we're focusing really on enterprise solutions. iOS and Android, that's important if you focus on the consumer market, because that are the big platforms. But if you look at the enterprise market, you see that there is still some gaps in the process flow of companies before they can start using AR or VR. And in my opinion, the content in the enterprise market is quite specific. But the platforms that creates the content, that is actually where the multi-billion-dollar question is. It's like the SAP for AR or VR, so to say. And that's actually where we're focusing on within our investments currently.
Yeah. The only other thing I'd add is that you're seeing some companies that have the ability to receive and get small checks, call it 1 to up to 5 million. And there's kind of a lot of guys that are playing in that game. There's a lot less companies that have been able to take in the $20 to $30 million checks. And so, I think there's probably a variety of reasons for that, one of which, I think funds are wanting to get their toes wet and learn before, really going all in. And so, it makes up for an interesting landscape. And a lot of companies, I think, are having to go overseas to make up for, the lack of the traditional funds here that, today aren't have the capacity or willingness to write those size checks.
So the landscape is very interesting, and how does the landscape compare to hardware versus software versus content, and what do you look for in a startup when they are promoting those different?
That's an interesting question. I always say AR/VR is currently where internet was in 1995. And what I mean by that is the hardware, the software, and the content has to be in balance before you create added value for your end customer. And what we currently see is that the first wave of hardware is out there. Can you compare with the first modems that were out there? So that's very in early stage, and we also see that here in the pitches, that there's a lot of improvement we have to do, especially in the AR hardware field, because it's up to par for a production environment. The same you can say to software. iOS, Android, the big platforms are still not full up to speed, and the content, it's still bloody expensive. I ordered a 2-minute movie of an F-35 fighter flying over the Netherlands, and it cost me 25,000 euros. It was 1 year ago. A year later, the same movie is 15,000 euros. So it's dropping, but it's still enormous amount of money. And that has to lower down before it's interesting and before there's added value for the mass markets and also for the enterprises.
Did I hear that right? 15,000 euros for a 2-minute movie?
Yeah.
Did you have it custom made?
Yeah, it was custom made.
Oh, okay. Yeah, got it. The next guy only paid $15.
Yeah, well, they use some models, but it's really time consuming at 80 euros or 100 euros an hour. Well, that adds up, I can tell you. So actually, the guy who figures out can lower the cost they are really having a big opportunity of earning money within the early stage market. And what I see is within the internet, it took quite some years before platforms like WordPress emerged, so you can create easily websites. And now I already see companies that started with training and simulation models, but already making the step to create a platform behind, so that I, without any knowledge of 3D modeling or Unity or whatever, can create my own training in their world created by them.
I was very interested in that question, coming from an accelerator and fundraising background. One of the key questions, whoever wrote that, I want to find out, how do they define hardware? My background is in silicon and semiconductor sector, where we actually work, or our startups actually work on making the front-end consumer product more effective. Say your headsets, if you're talking about hardware, VR headsets, how do you see different versions of it, and each version has a better chip involved in it. And that's the hardware I look at. So when you're talking about hardware and software, you're talking at the top level, or you're actually talking about how the product is being built, because that's where I would be interested in knowing. So if you say, how is the investment looking in hardware and software? For us, the startup that actually is going to make the consumer hardware or the enterprise hardware better, that's the startup we look at, and that's what interests us. Nothing against the product, but the background is more important for us to coordinate.
Anybody else? So when getting a pitch, what do you think most entrepreneurs miss?
So the answer to this is going to be different for each VC that you talk to, because their own personalities play into what they want to hear from the entrepreneur. So it's kind of tough. But from our perspective, there are two things that typically get missed. One is attention to brevity. I'm new at this. I've only been at it for 6 months. We've talked to about 200 companies, and the majority of them, when you ask a question, they give you a long answer. And just the respect for the time and the clarity that we hear from entrepreneurs that know how to effectively communicate and answer questions, I think is a really great value to a VC. Second is, you have to not only have a roadmap for what you're trying to accomplish in the near term, and that might be a year or two roadmap, but one thing that we like to see is a company that has a vision of how they can change the world. And we describe it as, you have to be a little bit crazy. If you're not, you're going to probably get run over by everyone else. And so an easy example of something that was crazy is Airbnb. So we kind of look for something that has a tangible near term, but if they just are focused, hyper-focused on that, we tend to discount it. We like to hear, this is what we're going to do, but ultimately we want to be something a lot bigger. Now some VCs might say, well, that's getting diluted and attention to focus, but from our perspective, those are two things that entrepreneurs miss.
Yeah, I would just echo that point. I think that's spot on, and especially in a marketplace where, headset adoption is not a meaningful penetration of, the U.S. consumer base. You kind of need to have a near-term strategy and a longer-term vision, and weaving those two together in a seamless, thoughtful way is what not every entrepreneur has really thought through.
Yeah, I'll just throw this one. I don't think I'm the only entrepreneur. It looks like you also started a company. I was an entrepreneur before. I didn't raise that much. I raised $5.5 million. But the lesson that I learned was actually in segmenting who you're going after. Really understand who you're going to go after and what they're interested in and what stages they invest in. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. I mean, I agree with all the points before, but if you're spending a lot of time in the meeting, you talked about the length question, which I think is, the brevity. I think that's a very good point. But I think if you're spending too much time explaining to them, and if they're not kind of buying, if they're not like buying, I think just say thank you and move on. Because you got to find people who really understand your sector and will kind of join and feel the pain points with you guys. Because if you are crazy, you got to find someone else who's also crazy who's going to go in with you.
So you got to do your homework.
Yeah, and through your entrepreneurial network and whatnot.
So you could literally spend the entire session on this topic alone. I was an entrepreneur for 25 years. I was fortunate enough to take my last company public. I spent 10 years helping 80 entrepreneurs raise rounds. Half of them succeeded in doing that. I've been involved in 200 rounds. I see 1,000 pitches a year. How many people here are entrepreneurs that are going to pitch for money at some point? Okay. So I'm going to spend just a little more time than we normally would. I sat in this audience and watched the pitches today. These were some of the less developed pitches I have seen in a long time. These are some pretty rudimentary, some of the businesses are more developed than the pitching. And so I would encourage you to think of the following: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Tell me those things. Tell me who you are. Tell me what you're doing. Tell me how you're doing it. Tell me why you're doing it, right? Without that, one of the classic mistakes that first-time entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs make, and many of the people in this community are these long narratives to get to the point. Nobody cares. The long narrative, there's this one, I have an entrepreneur of mine that's done great things, and he always used to lead his slide with the whole, and I apologize to the person that had this slide, I'm not picking on you. One of my own entrepreneurs just use this all the time. The monkey that turns into the primate, that turns into the Neanderthal man, that turns into the, and on and on and on. Yeah, I get it. Technology has evolved. What are you doing? Who are you? Why are you qualified to do it? Why does anybody care? Why is it a big market? It's very, very tactile, or tactical, I guess would be a better way to put it. You've got to get that point across, and you've got to get it across soon. If an entrepreneur can't tell me in one line what they do, I don't believe they truly understand what they do well enough to communicate it. And I've had many entrepreneurs that have gone through that journey, and sometimes it takes a year, sometimes it takes longer. But, you know, who, what, when, where, why, and how. Get that done. And as a last point, when you do an initial pitch, you're not going to get funded off that initial pitch. You're just going to start to build a relationship. I'm saying all these things knowing that I'm at risk of alienating people, but I was an entrepreneur for a long time, and nobody helped me by pussyfooting around the reality. If you want to build a relationship, you've got to start with the kernel of what you're doing. Crazy is often good because it comes out of genius. And you'll show, you know the best entrepreneurs in the world? They're the ones that show us all a vision of the future that we'd never thought of. You know, I think people think VCs are out there looking, well, I got to find the guy that's doing carpet for VR. No, it's just, you're going to show me a vision of the world. That's going to make me say, wow. And when I say, wow, oh my God, do I get excited. And you can't do that if you don't tell me what you're doing.
I just want to add one last thing. What you said is so true to most of the pitches that I have been to also, where they try to impress you with the whole concept, but do not go with the flow of what is needed in the short time that's given. One point I would like to add, I don't, this was a very, recently I've noticed it, and what I've noticed is, in the end, all the pitches, they show the team or the group of people who have contributed. And if I drill it down, and this is 9 out of 10 times I have noticed, when I drill it down, the truth is there's only one person who is genuinely doing the work. Rest of them are add-ons or supporting on ad hoc basis. And the concept, what I hear is, well, if you give the money, I'll hire all these people. And that kind of throws me off too. Well, how are you putting them on the radar? And is that how you're planning to get the money too? And that's something I have noticed it very recently in the last 6-7 months, that most of the advisors or employees also they show are not very on employees. They are the people, this startup or the entrepreneur is trying to hire based on the funding he or she is going to get. And I think that, I personally think that's something that they should think about, because you can't go forward unless until you have a good team, and your product cannot grow unless until you really build it together.
So what red flags and risks do you see in investing in the AR/VR space?
You know, I always used to say I need 5 things to make an investment. People, 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 a great idea and a huge market if it works. It doesn't matter whether it's AR and VR, red flags are going to be around those things. You're going to look at the quality of the team. Are you qualified to do this? It doesn't mean that you've built some huge company in the past. By the way, sometimes I think that people tend to try and inflate themselves because they have a preconceived notion of what we might want to fund. We all want to fund the same thing, brilliant people with brilliant dreams. It might be the very first dream they've had that's brilliant, and that's okay. Having said that, if you're going to build a 3-dimensional immersive world using brainstem technology that's going to cost you $500 million over the next 10 years, I'm going to want to know why you have the credibility to get that done. I'm assuming what you're going to do is build something pretty cool that you can deploy on mobile with a relatively modest amount of money. So the people are really crucial. The idea is important because, you know, the red flag of, I made something up, AR carpet for virtual worlds. I certainly wouldn't fund that. I would say that idea is not big enough for what I want to do. It might be an interesting niche business to sell to somebody over time. And then the size of market. You know, it's just, is this a big enough market? Sometimes people do things that are really, really cool and will be really, really cool to an incredibly small market. And those could be good acquisitions. And there are lots of different types of companies and different types of funding. But this session is about venture funding. And venture funding tends to follow a certain type of path and a certain type of goal.
I think actually that there's a difference in red flags between augmented reality market and the virtual reality market. The virtual reality market is much more developed at this current stage. I mean, you have big companies like HTC, Oculus, who has hardware out there which is working, and they have platforms out there which you can use to distribute your content. And in the AR space, there is nothing yet. There is no hardware that's good enough to use in a production environment, for example. At least I haven't seen it. And then people come up with, for example, with the tablets and with the phones. Yeah, but then you always have to download an app. There is no native support for it yet. So that is, for me, personally, a red flag to be very careful to invest in AR at this certain point. Although I believe that the AR market will be much bigger within 2 or 3 years from now than the VR market is. But because the VR market is much more mature, it's more easily to identify companies that really solve a problem in that market currently. Red flags in the VR market is that, yeah, we don't actually know where it's heading yet. It will be something social, but we have to try.
Oh, okay. So should startups invest or focus mostly on the tech of their pitch, or should they spend the time focusing on the team, the story, and the marketing?
What? Oh, go ahead.
I think it's 75% team, and we're seed stage investors. And I think part of that is just trying for us to get, Rita, I love that point about building a relationship, but just to get some sense about who you are, because the business is going to change. And so that's the bet we're making. I would also impress the importance of how you say things. Think about little things like your verbal clutter and just being really tight in how you communicate. I think that that becomes your brand, and that is a way to impress upon people like me that you're a thoughtful, clear thinker, strategic.
I was just going to say, focus on whatever's most special about your company or about your offering. I mean, it's just so hard to get a startup off the ground, and it's so hard to run it. And it sounds like he knows it the most, and then to take it to the next level. So, if your specialty is software, your specialty is software. If your specialty is the user experience, and that's going to differentiate you, focus more on that. Or and then whatever you think the market's going to need. If it's the hardcore tech and algorithm, so whatever is just most special and unique about the market and your offering.
Yeah, I agree. I think it totally depends on the business, right? Each business is different, focusing on a different aspect of the value chain ecosystem. Focus on the area that you provide the most differentiation value in the market. That said, you know, in an initial pitch, you kind of need to touch on all these things. But as Gene mentioned, you know, as early stage investors, team is what's really important, but you still have to be able to check the other boxes. So, you know, typically we do, you know, deeper technical due diligence on second, third, fourth meetings. So you don't need to spend, you know, half of the pitch on going deep really on the technical aspects, I think, in most cases.
So what's the best piece of counterintuitive advice you can offer entrepreneurs in this room?
I was waiting. Don't assume you should raise money. Don't assume you should raise venture capital. Question that constantly. We live in a community, to those of you that live here or visiting, where everything sort of ends up assuming it should raise venture. And I will tell you the vast majority of businesses should not. You know, remember I mentioned I see 1,000 pitches a year. That's an underestimate. Now that's everything from a 3-minute pitch on a stage like this to a 1-hour sit down. But how many companies do I fund a year? 1, maybe 2, Series A's. Now, does that mean all 999 others aren't worthy of venture capital and worthy is the wrong word there? No, but there's a lot of them that shouldn't raise venture, because think about what happens when you raise, I'll use a different word, professional institutional capital. What did I say that I wanted out of the journey with you? I want to believe there is a multi-billion-dollar public company at the end of a 10-year struggle. A wonderful struggle, but still a dangerous struggle, right? That's not necessarily appropriate. In fact, that's almost never appropriate. Now, let's say you have an investor that's only purpose is that. And we could talk about fund dynamics a lot, but the short version is, if you have a $100 million exit, who here thinks that's material to me as an investor? You're correct. It is not. I will own 20% of your company. I will get $20 million after 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years. I will go back to my LPs that gave me $300 million and say, here's $20 million. And they'll be like, and? I will not make any money. I will not make any carry. No one will care. I'll be lucky if my partners don't start giving me a hard time. I have no choice but to have the size of outcome I need, because in order for me to return a $300 million fund, I need a $1.5 billion exit, and I have to believe every company I try with has a chance to be that. So why am I rambling on about this? So now you have a $100 million opportunity to sell. Who here is unhappy with that, right? I'm not saying that should be your goal, but excuse me, I was about to say, man, if I own 80% of a company and I can get $100 million for it and sit on the sidelines with $80 million for a little while and figure out my life, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. But a professional investor has a very high risk of vetoing you out of that deal because it doesn't serve their purpose. That means you have to go back, and maybe that was the best you could have gotten, but because it's not material to them, it can cause a lot of trauma. I have never vetoed an investor in my life. I've never vetoed an entrepreneur, but I've seen it happen. I have friends who were, in their view, robbed of multi-hundred-million-dollar outcomes because the VC said, sorry, not good enough, right? Be really careful about who you take money from and what your own goals are. My last point on this is, if you only do one thing, it's understand what you need to achieve in your life and match your investor to that. You're all going to say whatever story you're going to say. I can't keep you from preaching that it's a billion-dollar opportunity when in your heart of hearts you know it's about a $50 million outcome if you do everything right. But if you know what it can be and you want it to be that, and that's good enough for you, find the investors that believe in the same song that your heart is singing, not the song your mouth opens up and sings when you try to convince a venture investor that it's such a huge opportunity. Align with your investor, because in the end, you can work a really long time to end up with a really painful outcome if you are not aligned with the people that give you money.
I think that's a very good advice. But I see in practice, and I don't know how it is in the States, but in Europe we have quite some different funding forms. Not only venture capital, but we have other government funds that are kind of loans. We have banks that can offer you money. We have angels that can offer you money. We have crowdfunding. We have all kinds of different financing forms. And I'm always wondering that the startups that come and pitch, they try all the different financing forms. And to go with your story, VC is a very specific finance form for which you should be really open. And in my opinion, you should really choose for that financing form and not do it because you maybe get some money somewhere. And I think that's something really good to realize as a startup.
Just want to add one last piece to that. Be proud and happy of what you do as an entrepreneur. It doesn't matter what the exit is. You should be able to motivate yourself to start another one. If the previous one doesn't motivate you, then there's something that went wrong right there.
Okay, so how are you finding your next investments? Are you open to cold calls? And how do you hear about the next great thing?
This is a big topic for VCs, is deal flow, because the limited partners, the investors within the fund, want to know that they're getting looks at all the great companies before everybody else. And so what VCs will talk to their limited partners about is how they have this great deal flow based on relationships, which means that as a cold call coming in, even if it's a phenomenal idea, you're probably going to be viewed skeptically. So my suggestion would be try to find a way to network into the VC.
Yeah, we do cold calling. Sometimes we call even companies our own to get the deal flow going. But for me personally, my successful investments took quite a time, because you first have to establish a relationship. And to be really honest, I've never seen a startup that was ready at the time I meet him to be financed. And that's maybe also because I'm more at the business developer side of our company. So it takes quite a while before a company is even ready to finance. And in that period, you can coach a company, you can see how good the team is, if the team does fit the market, and if they fit together, if there are any gaps, and if there is a click between you and the team. And that can take some time. I have cases where it took almost 2 years before we finally invested in a company. Sometimes we will never invest. Nobody will invest. But that does take before getting an investment. And you should really realize that as a startup. And also be open for the advice, because I don't see 1,000 pitches, but maybe 500 or 600. So we see a lot of people coming by, and we really know how the game is being played. So be open for that advice, and I think that can really help you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think different funds, different investors have different points of view on this specific topic. Personally, I'm not a fan of the cold intro, cold call, cold email, principally because it's indicative on your ability to network and sell. And so I think that says something. So find a way, a friend of a friend of a friend, to get in the door, get an intro. I think it's always a much better approach than blindly sending, an email.
So having been in that boat a couple of times, one of the key things that I learned from my experience was being a first-time entrepreneur, it was very hard to even know somebody in the VC world, let alone anybody who could connect you to a VC world, because everybody is not sure, even if they're your best friend, they don't know how good you are, and they want to keep their reputation. The channel that I found that helped me was going through an accelerator. When I started the startup at the accelerator, one of the key things I noticed was the accelerator also has a lot of direct connections with select VCs. And these VC firms or investment firms actually are very open to looking and listening to the pitches with a more welcoming view rather than just an individual approaching. And even today with Silicon Catalyst, we do the same thing. We have connections with a few select VC firms who focus on our sector. And the first batch itself, out of the 7 startups, 4 got funded very easily because they were part of the accelerator. And my experience was also very good with the accelerator. So if the networking is you see as a long-term or an effort towards you, try to see which accelerators can actually help you, not an incubation, but an accelerator that can actually build that little bridge for you to go towards the VCs.
So the fashion industry is about $3 trillion, and they're yet to leverage the AR/VR space. Customers are looking for new experiences, especially since the stores are closing down. What are the opportunities there?
Let me say that. Go ahead.
I think there are definitely opportunities, but you have one big problem in the AR market, especially when you focus on the consumer, is you don't know what the winning platform will be. And I see, and Tim Merrill was just in the room, and he said it also to me, I see a lot of pitches today of companies that do something or have an app, for example, for the stores. But when, for example, an Apple or Android is taking off, they're out of business. And that is, I think, the biggest risk currently in AR, that if that's happening, you're nowhere. There's no uniqueness in your proposition. And you should really focus on that, in my opinion.
Just adding to what my colleague was saying, currently, so far what I have seen in AR and VR is you're very limited to a headset to actually experience something. If you are going to a consumer, your assumption is the consumer has that product to actually view the VR, AR experience. With that assumption, if you are asking if there's an opportunity, yes. If that is a limitation, then it has to, you need more research to find out if the opportunity still exists.
Yeah, I would just add, and I think I'm cutting and pasting from what someone else said earlier here. I think the entrepreneur needs to tell us what that opportunity is and why it's special and why now. I mean, I think that the last part is very, very important to what you were saying. Why now? Why is it going to work with this set of infrastructure today? But, you know, I think they need to be telling us that for us to get compelled.
Right. Anybody else? No? Okay, I think that's it. We ran out of time. Thank you very much, panel, for being here and imparting your wisdom. Thank you.